Hi everyone, this is Sarah and Shane. Welcome to episode 9 of our scenario-based demo series. Today we'll be discussing server-side auto-labeling. However, before we get into the actual details of what we're really focusing on today, I did want to go through a brief agenda so everybody could have an understanding of what will be covered, right? So, of course, we're going to be going through a recap of what happened last time in our episode with client-based auto-labeling. We're going to then jump on over into overall what is server-side labeling, some of the recent updates that we announced, and then, of course, going into a demo with one of my colleagues. So, all right. So let's go ahead and jump into the recap of last episode, right? So first of all, we did go through the background of what is client-side auto-labeling, and then we went through the steps of kind of what is required in our custom sensitive information type for our COVID scenario in our test environment in general. And then we walked through the different ways that our behavior and logic really need to kind of, I guess in this case, I hate to use the same word again, but behave, right? How we want our environment to actually interact. And then, of course, we had our awesome demo that walked through how that would behave in your environment and then the custom information type as well. So awesome. Let's go ahead and jump into talking about the MIP auto labeling feature, right? So this would be overall on the server side auto labeling. So what exactly is the server side auto labeling? What it is it's auto labeling for data at rest, right? So you have documents in SharePoint, you have documents in OneDrive, and then auto labeling for data in transit. So emails being received, emails being sent. What that doesn't include is the ability to kind of walk through the data at rest in Exchange, so those mailboxes as well. So that's kind of a brief overview of what it really is. Now, the question that we ask ourselves next is why? Why is this important? Why is it something that we should implement in our environment? The main reason that I would kind of jump in here is that it really doesn't matter what users have in terms of their apps, their operating systems, and the different versions, because at the end of the day, it's happening server side, right? So within SharePoint, within OneDrive, or within Exchange. So it doesn't really matter what these users have themselves. So it's the service that really does that job. And kind of due to this, not kind of, it is due to this, right? You have the ability to actually deploy this at scale. So this makes it a lot easier for many of our organizations. It takes away some of the onus from the user and goes ahead and puts it on the administrator side. So it's cool in that sense that you can deploy this almost immediately. What about the recommended labeling? And so in this environment, we really don't need to focus too much on the recommended labeling. Why? It's because you're taking the user out of the equation in general, right? You have the service, you have SharePoint, OneDrive, and Exchange. You don't have the user. So there's no need to recommend because you're automatically going through and doing the auto labeling for those files or emails, depending on what it is that you're doing the auto labeling on itself. So there's no interaction for recommendation. It's all set up by the administrator. So that's definitely the why. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the how, right? So at a very high level, you have an administrator who creates and runs through the policies in the simulation mode to make sure that it's labeling correctly, and then you turn it on. That's very much so simplified, but it's one of the good components of this is that it's actually a little bit easier, right? So now let's break that up into a couple of different steps. So of course you go into creating a different policy, you choose your locations. Within your locations, you have the ability to define your rules. You choose a label that you're going to apply with that rule set. And then, of course, you run it in simulation mode to ensure that when you do turn it on, that it behaves the way it actually should behave. With that being said, we're going to jump on over into the updates overall. So one of the cool things is that previously we used to have a maximum number of 10 auto labeling policies per tenant. Now we have increased that to 100. We now have support for all OneDrive and SharePoint sites. It's actually the default configuration you have when you go into your environment. And the ability to actually be able to select these sites, it's not just dependent on manually inputting your URL itself. If you have new policies that are in place or anything that you've gone through within the tenant itself, They are automatically included there in the policy itself. You can still include sites manually, but it automatically pops up. So it's a lot cooler and a lot easier in that sense. Now, the other thing to note is that when you are specifying these sites, specific sites within a policy itself, that you can now include up to 100 sites instead of 10 sites. So again, this has also been increased 10 times as well. Now, the other part here is that we have a maximum of 1 million matched files per auto labeling policy. And the cool thing is that the total of 25,000 automatically labeled files in your tenant per day does not change. So that kind of works together in that sense here. On the simulation side, instead of waiting up to almost 48 hours, it's now completed within about 12 hours, so that's really cool. You also have a lot better performance in your environment. With that being said, now that you have a little bit more background on the service side auto labeling, we're going to go ahead and turn this over to my awesome colleague, Brendan Lee, and he's going to walk through some of our demos today. Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Brendan Lee, and once again, welcome to our SBD series. As we mentioned, today I'm going to walk us through setting up a server-side auto labeling policy. So let's go ahead and get started. So as you are all probably aware, this is the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, or the MCC. So today we're going to be setting up, as I said, server-side auto labeling policies, which is available within the Information Protection tab of the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. But first, I want to go take a look at this data classification tab at the custom sensitive information type that we created in the last episode. So if I click on data classification, I can then click on sensitive information types, and that's going to load all of the sensitive information types that we have within our tenant. I can quick and easily search for the sensitive information type or SIT that I want over here, to say COVID. And that's going to pull up all the SITs that match that name. In this case, we have our COVID-19 data SIT that we created in the last episode. So I'm going to go ahead and select this. And as you can see, it allows us to go in there and see all of the settings that we have within this particular SIT. Now, this is really important because this is what I'm going to be using within the server-side auto labeling policy in order to apply labels automatically to content out within Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive. So now if we jump over to this Information Protection tab, to get to server-side auto labeling, we need to use the Auto Labeling tab. Now, server-side auto labeling is going to be a little bit different than client-side auto labeling. Server-side auto labeling is used essentially when you want to apply or auto label whenever items are in transit for Exchange, or for SharePoint and OneDrive when items are at rest, right? So data that's just kind of sitting around in different sites and different locations. You can apply server-side auto labeling policies to apply labels to that content. It's really important because it allows you to kind of scale to all of your existing sites without having to worry about whether someone's going to directly open that file for client-side auto labeling to label. So as you can see, I have no auto labeling policies here defined within the server-side auto labeling component. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create Auto Label Policy. Now, the first screen is going to ask if I want to use any kind of templates, essentially, to create this particular policy. In my case, I'm using a custom SIT. I don't really want to use any of these out-of-the-box categories. So I'm going to go ahead and select Custom and then choose the Custom Template, which says, essentially, I want to create a blank template and build it as we go through this wizard. The next screen is going to, of course, ask for our name and our description. So we want to try to be very descriptive here, because this is something that is going to tell other admins what this particular policy does, right? Let's go ahead and call it SBD Highly Confidential COVID. And in the description, we're going to give more descriptive label as to what this policy does. So we're going to say applies a highly confidential label to COVID-related content within SharePoint and OneDrive, and exchange data in transit. Now, I mentioned data in transit here, and this is something to keep in mind. With Exchange and auto labeling, we don't have the capability currently to go back and apply labels automatically to data at rest. So instead, what this policy will do is anytime a message is sent that matches this policy, it'll then go ahead and apply this label. Now, if a label is already set on the message that is sent, we're not going to replace that label because the manual action of applying a label by a user is going to take precedence over the auto labeling capabilities of this particular policy. So let's go ahead and hit next with this configuration. The next screen is then to detect the different locations that we want to go ahead and apply this particular policy to. As we described in the last screen, we're going to apply it to Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive. Now, this is also where you're able to be a little explicit as to what locations or what parts of the locations that you want this policy to apply to. For Exchange, you can apply to all users, right? Or you can choose individual users or individual groups of users. If you're testing out a policy, you may choose to apply it to just a small group of users and then kind of gradually grow that group until you are able to then apply it to the entire organization. For ease, we're going to choose all here. Now, for SharePoint and OneDrive, this is a new feature that has recently been released. And that is the ability to apply this policy to all SharePoint and OneDrive sites. This is really important because previously we were only able to apply to a maximum of 10 individual SharePoint sites or OneDrive accounts. So now that we can apply it to all these different locations, we can really expand this policy to cover the entire organization, sort of like a blanket policy that's able to apply these rules to all sites that we may have and all sites that get created after this point. So we're going ahead and click next again. Now you can choose to use some common rules for the locations that exist, or you can choose to create your own rules using the advanced rules section. For the same reason I didn't want to use any templates, I'm going to go ahead and choose advanced rules here. That way I can go through and design the policy exactly how I want. Now, we're going to go through each of the different locations and create a rule for that particular location, defining how we want to identify and apply labels to content. Now, if you remember with Exchange, I just said a couple minutes ago that it applies to data in transit only and not data at rest. So we need to keep that in mind when we're creating this rule as well as the policy. So let's go ahead and click New Rule. Now we can name the rule something descriptive and then give it also a descriptive description, just like we did with the policy itself. So for example, the rule, we can say SBD auto label change rule, and the description will say applies high confidence label to COVID data in Exchange, data in transit, or IT. Now, once we have that defined, we can then figure out what conditions we want to use. We can click here, and as you can see, we have quite a few different options that we can use. We can say, for example, if the content is shared internally or externally, or we can just not define that and it'll apply to content that's shared both internally and externally. For this particular use case, we want to apply that to content that has that custom sensitive information type within it. So we're going to go ahead and say content contains sensitive information types, and we're going to go ahead and click Add, then choose sensitive information types. Once again, we can search for it by just typing COVID, enter, and you'll see that it pops up here. Now, one important thing to keep in mind here is that you can actually select multiple if you want. So without having to close this whole applet, I can just clear out my search and I can look for SSN, for example, if I wanted to, and select that, and it'll say to selected, so that when I hit add, it'll add them all at once. This is kind of a shortcut way of, not having to go in and out of this applet to be able to add, several different sits. In this case, we really want to just add the COVID sit though. So I'm going to go ahead and deselect social security number and then click add. As you can see, COVID-19 data is now added, and our default confidence level, which we set to medium within the sit, is selected by default. Now, some of the other things that are here I wanted to cover as well, and this is one of them. All of these and any of these. This is essentially an and or an or statement. So you're saying I want it to match all of the sensitive information types or all of the different conditions that I define here, or any of these, right? So all of these would be the and, any of these would be the or. Now, it doesn't really matter in our case because we only have one sit that we're going to add here. But if you did have multiple sits that you wanted to add, if you wanted it to match on any of those different sits, you would, of course, choose any of these. The other thing is, by default, we label this sensitive information type group as default. You can change this if you want. You don't have to change it. I like to do it just in case later I want to add another group. It just kind of keeps things organized. So I'm going to go ahead and add COVID sits. And then finally, the instance count. The instance count is how many instances of this particular sensitive information type that we detect within the content should be a match, right? So you could say, for example, 1 to any, meaning if you find any instances of this particular sit within the content, it'll be a match. However, if you want to make it a little harder to match, you may want to increase that, right? So you can go up to 2, 3, 4, whatever you want to configure it. In our case, we're just going to choose 1. So now I can click save, and that's going to save that exchange rule that I created. As you can see, it has a status of on, and if I need to make changes, of course, I can go in here and edit. So we're going to go ahead and click next. Next is the SharePoint rules. So once again, we're going to go ahead and create new, and I'm going to call this one something similar. Now, with SharePoint, it's a little bit different than Exchange. I mentioned before with Exchange, it's data in transit only. So someone drafts an email, they send it, we detect, and then we apply the label. With SharePoint, we're actually targeting data at rest, right? So the data has to actually be there and actually can't even be open within a client before it's able to be labeled by the server-side auto-labeling service. So it's really meant for data that's just kind of sitting there, right? Hence the data at rest. So we're going to go ahead and click new condition. As you can see, we have a couple different options here, not nearly as many as we had with Exchange. We only have the ability to add content is shared or content contains sensitive information types. Content is shared is going to be similar to the Exchange, but more related to if somebody were to share the content through SharePoint to an external user or an internal user. In this case, again, we really only want to look for the COVID sensitive information type. So we're going to choose content contains. For this, I'm going to name it COVID. Choose any of these, click add sensitive information types. Again, we're going to go ahead and search for COVID. Add it. Now, before I click next, I wanted to also point out something that you can do if you want to make these a little bit more complex, right? You may notice the create group option down here. And I didn't mention it when we were talking about Exchange, but that it was there as well. You can click create group to create these different groups of sits if you want, right? So for example, we have COVID sits here. We can also say maybe PII sits, right? And then you can then add sensitive information types that are related to PII. So this kind of allows you to, again, be just a little bit more flexible and a little bit more organized when you're creating these policies, as well as allow the policy to find different types of content based on how you configure it, right? So as you see here, we have an and or an or, so we can say COVID sits and PII sits need to be found in order for it to be a match, or we can say or, which means that either of these need to be found before it's a match. So I'm going to go back to what we had before, which was just the COVID-19 data. Go ahead and click Save. And again, we have our status on and our little edit symbol. And then finally, we want to apply it to OneDrive files. Go ahead and click New Rule. Again, something simple, description. All right, and then we're going to go ahead and create a condition. Now, OneDrive is very similar to SharePoint. It's essentially SharePoint's the back end of OneDrive, right? So you're going to have very similar conditions as you would with the SharePoint location. So I'm going to go ahead and click sensitive information type again. Just to any of these, just in case I in the future want to add anything, we default to the or instead of the and. Go ahead and click add. And once again, find my COVID. That's it. Medium confidence, instance count of 1 to any. So go ahead and click save. And then next. The next screen, of course, is to then say, well, what label do you want to auto apply? Now, you can only choose one label, of course, because we're automatically applying a label to content based on, sensitive information. We can't choose, what type of or which label to apply within this particular policy. However, if you did have multiple labels that you want to auto apply, you could, of course, create multiple auto labeling policies to do that. So as I mentioned in all the descriptions, we're going to be applying the highly confidential label. So we'll go ahead and select that as our one label to auto apply. It does give you a little warning here that, hey, encryption is turned on. So there's some content that's going to be affected by that, right? It's going, as soon as the label gets applied, it's also going to have that encryption follow it. So now we have our label applied. We're going to go ahead and hit next. Now this next screen is where you really have two options. You can either turn on the policy in what we call simulation mode or leave the policy off. Now you may want to leave the policy off if you're just not sure, like you want to make changes maybe before you turn it on, or maybe you have to turn it on at a certain time because of change control. But the other option, of course, is running in simulation mode. As you notice, there is no just turn the policy on. And the reason is because this server-side auto labeling is going out and auto applying these labels directly to content within your organization, most likely your production environment, right? So we don't want to, accidentally apply all these labels, especially labels with encryption, to content without being absolutely sure that the settings we've defined within this policy are exactly what we want. So we kind of force you to use simulation mode, right? So I'm going to go ahead and select run the policy in simulation mode. And I'm going to go ahead and hit next, can review all of my different settings, and then choose to create the policy. And that's it. As you can see, we get the success message. The policy has been created. So if you check the next steps, it says we need to run simulation. It's going to take a few hours. We're going to then be able to hopefully see some results within simulation mode to determine whether the policy is configured accurate enough for us to turn it on throughout the organization. So I'm going to go ahead and click done. Now, if we look at the auto labeling tab here in the information protection page, you'll see that we now have a policy that we created, and it's in this simulation kind of drop down, right? This indicates that this policy is running within simulation mode. Now, if I select that, I'm going to open up that policy in simulation mode, and you're going to see a bunch of different types of information within here. We can see that we are currently running simulation mode. It says right here, it usually takes a few hours. This is another benefit to the recent improvements we've made on simulation mode, as it used to take up to 48 hours. Now it only takes a few hours for us to run simulation mode and be happy with the results. So as you can see down here, we're going to be able to see some of the content. We'll see matched items. That should start to increase as we detect content. Once we've determined that we're good with this, right, we're going to go ahead and click this turn on policy button. But you can see that it's currently grayed out because we're not done with simulation mode. We need simulation mode to complete before we can actually turn it on after we've determined that everything's good. Everything was not good, let's say, because maybe we needed to add another sit to be a little bit more explicit. What we can do is go in, edit the policy, come back in, and then tell it to restart simulation mode. And that will then reapply that simulation mode to all the locations. Anytime you make a change to an auto labeling policy, or server-side auto labeling policy, I should say, it's going to force you to run in simulation mode, because again, we don't want to accidentally apply labels, especially with encryption, to content inadvertently. Now, once we start getting results here, we're also going to be able to select these items and see the actual content of those items, right? So it's actually going to give us the ability to really review within this whole dashboard the different types of items that were detected by this policy, and allow us to make a better decision whether the policy is accurate or not. So now we have to let the simulation mode run for 4 hours, and then we're going to come back after 4 hours and take a look at it and see what it found. Now, the policy is still in simulation, as you can see. So what I'm going to do is test to make sure that the policy is not actually doing anything, right? So you remember we applied it to the Exchange location. So I'm going to jump over to OWA, which is outlook.office.com, and I'm going to send a message over to Waleed, right? I'm going to say, take a look at this, and I'm going to send some data that should be detected by that policy itself. And we'll test this after we turn on the policy as well. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and hit send.
Thanks, Brendan. Now let's see the behavior of the email labeling that applied to Brendan's message. Just bear in mind, as Brendan mentioned, the server-side auto label for Exchange has not been enabled yet. So here I can see the email I got from Brendan, which includes the COVID-related information in the attachment. I can open the attachment and I can access the content. In here, if you notice, the classification general label has been applied. From episode 6, Maca configured the default label for everyone in the tenant. If you haven't watched this, please go back and watch that. So the default label has applied to all the messages that didn't have a label. So that should change once we enable the server-side auto label for Exchange. So we will go back to Brendan to make that happen and come back and test again. Over to you, Brendan.
Now, if you take a look here, you can see that I've received an email alert that indicates the MIP auto label simulation has completed. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back over to the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, over to the auto labeling tab under the information protection. And I'm going to select my auto labeling policy. Now, as I open that up, the first thing you're going to notice here is that turn on policy has lit up. So it's no longer grayed out. I can go ahead and click that if I'm happy with the results that the simulation mode yielded. So I'm going to go down here and I can see that we have 2 items within SharePoint that were detected and 0 items within OneDrive that were detected. In our case, that's exactly what we were looking for. But one thing that you may want to do is just make sure that the numbers make sense for your organization, right? If you expect to get some results within in OneDrive, you may want to review your OneDrive rule, right? Or your SharePoint rule. So you can click items to review up here. And that's going to, again, bring up this little portal that shows the different locations and the different content that was detected. So you can see here, we actually have some Exchange items as well that showed up with the little email icon. But the first thing I'm going to do is take a look at some of these items that were detected within SharePoint. So I'm going to select this document. So as you can see, we opened up a source view, which gives us a sort of a view within this portal of what's actually in that document, right? So we can actually review this and see like, hey, does this actually match or does this have any kind of data within it that would match? You can also zoom in, of course. You can move down from page to page. It's kind of it's more like a viewer, right? So you don't have full capabilities in here. Of course, you can't type, but you can go ahead and review it and make sure that it makes sense. And if you need to do more, you can go ahead and view the document metadata, which gives you all the information about why that was actually detected, as well as the location that it was detected in, so that if you need to go get that file, you can use either a content search within the Compliance Center here, or go directly out to that SharePoint site and grab it if you were to have permissions. Now, that's actually really important to mention here. I don't actually have permissions to this SharePoint site. This is the server-side auto-labeling component actually using a impersonation to be able to go out and review and grab that file so that we can review it without me having to actually have access to that SharePoint site. So I don't have to go through and add myself as a SharePoint admin. I don't have to go through and add myself as a site collection administrator to any of the SharePoint sites. I'm still able to review the results here within this portal. Now we take a look at the emails, something similar. We can look at source view. We can see the content of the actual email. In this case, Wally had sent an email that had no body, so we're not going to see any body here. We can jump over to metadata though, and we can see again all the different information that led to this message being detected in simulation mode for this policy. Now we can also use some of the filters. We're going to pull up to 100 files per site, so there could be a pretty large amount of files here if you're in a production environment. So you can use some of the basic filtering and drop downs here to kind of filter your view and get down to the exact file that you want to look at to make sure that the policy meets your needs, such as selecting an individual location, selecting any of the individual rules, which in our case line up with the different locations, and then of course also by date, which for us it was very quick. Within 4 hours, we were able to go in there and review simulation mode results. So once we're happy with this, we can go ahead and turn on the policy. Again, if we were not happy with it, let's say something didn't match or it got too many false positives, we could go in and choose to edit the policy, then come back and rerun simulation mode. But in this case, we're pretty happy with the results. So we're going to go ahead and click turn on policy. It's going to give you sort of a warning like, hey, are you sure you want to turn on this policy? Again, remember, we're publishing a label that will enable encryption. So we need to be really careful about turning this particular type of policy on. So I'm going to go ahead and click confirm because I've reviewed the documents that we've detected, and I know that this is what it is accurate and it's as we configured it. Once we click to confirm, we're going to go through, it's going to publish the policy, and then we'll get a little status message indicating that the policy was published. It'll take us back to the auto labeling tab, which once it comes up, you'll see that we now are under the status of on. So if I had multiple policies here, you may see some under simulation, and you may see some under on, and you may even see some under off if you chose to not turn the policy on quite yet. So it's going to essentially organize them based on their status. So now that we've enabled the policy, let's go ahead and do the exact same test that we did before with Exchange by sending an email to Waleed and see if it now is able to auto-label based on the policy configuration. So I'm going to go in here and click New Message. And again, select to go to Waleed. I'm going to add a subject. And attach the document that we had sent before. And then I'm going to go ahead and click Send. Now, my expectation is that when Waleed gets it, it should have auto-applied the highly sensitive label that we told it to based on the policy configuration.
Perfect. Thanks, Brendan. Now, as you can see, I have received the email, the other test email that Brendan just sent, just comparing the both emails, same sender, same recipient, same attachment, basically same everything. First thing that you notice that the new email from Brendan, before clicking even on it, you can see the little lock here displaying on the message up there. That means it's encrypted. So let me click on it. Now you can see the highly confidential label has been applied by the server-side auto label because the data included in the email has matched the parameter that we defined in the service auto label rule. Now, just a reminder that Brendan is not part of the COVID-19 research group. That's why he didn't get prompt to label the email before he sent it, which translates to mandatory labeling that we showed in the previous episodes. Now back to Brendan to close out this session. Thank you.
Well, that wraps up our episode on server-side auto labeling. So hopefully it was helpful to you and you enjoyed it as much as I did. In the next episode, we'll start working on a new technology, Intune. So make sure that you hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to get notifications on future episodes. And we'd love to hear from you on how we're doing. So please leave a comment with any feedback or requests that you have. See you next time. Bye.
Welcome back. Thank you for watching so far, and I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to watch our next videos in this great scenario-based demo video series that we prepared just for you. Also, make sure to check out our one-stop shop resource page that we prepared just for you that contains all our resources from the MIPC team. That's at aka.ms/MIPC/OSS. Thank you, and see you on our next videos.